There are things that happen on American highways that nobody wants to talk about. Things that challenge everything we believe about safety and security in our own country. Things that happen to normal people doing normal things, pulling over to rest, stopping to help someone, taking a break from a long drive. And then they simply vanish, gone, disappeared into the darkness like they never existed at all. I've spent months researching cases of people who pulled over at night on American highways and were never seen again. The cases I'm about to share with you are three of the most disturbing, most unexplainable, and most tragic examples of what can happen when you're alone on a dark road and something goes catastrophically wrong. The first story involves a man named Michael Chen, who pulled over on Interstate 40 in Arizona in 1993. He was driving a dark blue sedan, a regular car, not a truck. He stopped to rest for what should have been a 15-minute nap. He never woke up. His car was found the next morning completely empty. His wallet, his keys, his personal belongings all still inside. Michael Chen simply vanished. To this day, nobody knows what happened to him. The case remains unsolved, and the theories range from abduction to serial killer activity to something far stranger that defies rational explanation. The second story is about a woman named Sarah Mitchell, who pulled over on a remote stretch of Highway 101 in Northern California in 2001. She stopped to use a roadside rest area late at night in her car. She called her husband to say she was okay and would be back on the road in 10 minutes. That was the last time anyone ever heard from her. Sarah Mitchell disappeared without a trace. Her car was found with the engine still running and the door wide open. It was like she'd simply stepped out of her car and into thin air. The third story involves a family, the Hartley family, who pulled over on a dark stretch of Highway 285 in Colorado in 1989. They stopped because their young daughter needed to use the bathroom. The parents waited by the car. They said later that they only looked away for a moment. When they turned back, their daughter was gone. Rachel Hartley was 7 years old. She vanished in broad daylight. Well, relative daylight, it was early evening, in front of her parents, and she was never found. These three cases have something in common beyond the obvious. They all involve people pulling over on American highways. They all involve moments of vulnerability. They all involve disappearances that defy rational explanation. And they all involve questions that were never answered, families that were never given closure, and mysteries that have haunted investigators for decades. What happened to these people? Where did they go? Who took them? Were they victims of serial killers? Were they part of something stranger, something that exists in the margins of documented reality? I don't have all the answers, but I have the stories, and the stories are absolutely terrifying. Before we dive into the absolutely horrifying details of what happened to Michael Chen on Interstate 40, I need to ask you something. What state are you watching this from right now? Are you from Arizona, where Michael disappeared? Maybe you're from California or Colorado or somewhere completely different that I never would have guessed. I really want to know. Drop your state in the comments below, because I genuinely want to understand who's watching these stories and where you're coming from. And while you're down there in the comments, hit that like button if these stories about people vanishing after pulling over on highways are absolutely terrifying you. Show YouTube that you want more content like this. Stories about unsolved mysteries, stories about missing people, stories that will make you think twice before pulling over on a dark road. And if you haven't subscribed to Christmas Terror yet, what are you waiting for? We've got incredible stories coming all the time. Stories about disappearances, true crime, and mysteries that will haunt you. Subscribe now, hit that notification bell, and never miss a video. Now let's get into this, because what happened to Michael Chen was absolutely terrifying. Michael Chen was a car salesman who'd been traveling across the Southwest for work. He drove a dark blue sedan, a reliable car that he'd owned for several years. He was the kind of guy who took care of his vehicle, kept it maintained, kept it in good condition. He wasn't a trucker. He wasn't someone who spent his life on the road. He was a salesman who traveled occasionally for work, someone who knew the highways, but who wasn't intimately familiar with every rest stop and every route. In March of 1993, Michael was driving from Phoenix to Albuquerque on a business trip. It was a stretch he'd driven before, but not regularly. He was making decent time, listening to the radio, thinking about the sales meetings he had ahead of him. Around 2 a.m., he was getting tired. He'd been driving for several hours straight, and he knew he needed to rest. Falling asleep at the wheel was dangerous. He wasn't going to do that. He saw a rest area on Interstate 40 near Flagstaff, Arizona. It looked well lit and relatively busy. Other cars were parked there. He figured he could pull in, rest for 15 minutes, and then get back on the road refreshed. It seemed like a safe choice. It seemed like the responsible thing to do. Michael pulled into the rest area and parked his sedan in a well-lit spot. He locked the doors. He settled into the driver's seat, reclined it slightly, and closed his eyes. He told his dispatcher he was stopping for a short break. He said he'd be back on the road in 15 minutes. Everything seemed normal. Everything seemed routine. What happened next is where the story becomes inexplicable. When another driver came through the rest area about 90 minutes later, something was wrong. Michael's car was still there, but Michael was gone. The driver's side door was closed and locked. The windows were up. There was no sign of forced entry. There was no indication of struggle. Michael's car simply contained no Michael. He'd vanished. When police arrived, they found Michael's wallet on the driver's seat. They found his keys in the ignition. They found his phone, well, his car phone, this was 1993, in the dash. They found his watch on the passenger seat. They found everything he owned, but they didn't find Michael. He'd disappeared from a locked car in a well-lit rest area on a major American highway, leaving behind every possession he had with him. The search began immediately. Police checked hospitals and jails. They contacted his family. They searched the rest area and the surrounding area. They checked his car for evidence. But Michael Chen had simply vanished. To this day, nobody knows what happened to him. His case remains unsolved. And the circumstances of his disappearance remain completely unexplainable. The investigation into Michael Chen's disappearance raised questions that law enforcement couldn't answer. The first question was simple. How did he leave a locked car? Michael's sedan had automatic locks. The doors were locked from the inside. The windows were closed and intact. There was no evidence of forced entry. There was no broken glass. There were no signs of struggle. Michael was simply gone. The second question was about motive. Why would Michael voluntarily disappear? He had a job he'd been doing for years. He had regular sales clients who depended on him. He had a routine. There was nothing in his background to suggest he was planning to disappear. There were no financial problems. There were no personal crises. There was no indication that he wanted to leave his life behind. The third question was practical. Where would he go? Michael was in the Arizona desert at 2 a.m. He had no wallet, no keys, no identification on him. He had no transportation. He couldn't hitchhike without being able to identify himself. He couldn't walk anywhere without being exposed to the elements. In the Arizona desert at night, exposure alone could be life-threatening. And why would he leave his car in a well-lit rest area where it would obviously be found? Police considered the possibility that Michael had simply stepped out of his car and walked away. But he had no wallet and no identification. Where would he go? How would he survive? And if he was having some kind of mental health crisis, wouldn't someone have reported seeing a confused man in the desert? They considered the possibility that Michael had been abducted. But there were other people at the rest area. Someone would have seen something. And Michael's car was locked. If someone had taken Michael, how would the car end up locked, unless Michael had been forcibly removed and the abductor had locked the car afterward? But there were no signs of forced entry. There was no evidence of violence. There was nothing to suggest a struggle. They considered the possibility that Michael had fallen victim to a predator, someone targeting people at rest areas. But again, there were other people there. Someone would have noticed something, and the absence of a body, the absence of any physical evidence, made this theory hard to support. Weeks of investigation turned up nothing. Months turned into years. Michael Chen's case grew cold. No body was ever found. No ransom demand was ever made. No credible sightings were ever reported. It was as if Michael Chen stepped out of his car and simply ceased to exist. His family never got answers. His case was never solved. And Michael joined the growing list of people who pulled over and disappeared. Over the years, various theories have been proposed about what happened to Michael Chen. Some of them are rational, some of them are decidedly not. But the fact that so many different theories exist speaks to the fundamental mystery of the case. The absolute lack of a satisfactory explanation. The first theory is serial killer activity. Arizona had a significant problem with serial killers during the 1990s. The idea was that a killer had been targeting people at rest areas, that Michael had been in the wrong place at the wrong time, and that he'd been abducted and murdered by someone who knew how to operate undetected. But if this were true, where was the body? And how would a serial killer have accessed a locked car? And why leave all of Michael's possessions inside? A serial killer would want to hide evidence, not leave a car full of identification and valuables. The second theory is that Michael suffered a medical event. A heart attack, a stroke, something sudden that caused him to lose consciousness or become disoriented. The theory goes that Michael somehow managed to exit the car despite being incapacitated, wandered into the desert, and died of exposure. But again, there are problems with this theory. If Michael was having a medical emergency, why would he be capable of unlocking and opening a locked car door? Why would he be coherent enough to exit the car, but not coherent enough to call for help? And extensive searches of the desert around the rest area found nothing. The third theory is that Michael simply abandoned his life voluntarily. He locked his car, got out, and walked away, starting a new life somewhere else. But this doesn't explain why he'd leave his wallet, his identification, his money, his watch. If you're going to disappear voluntarily, you take your means of survival with you. You don't leave everything behind. You don't make it easy for people to find your car and trace your movements. The fourth theory is that Michael's disappearance involved foul play from someone at the rest area. Perhaps someone was monitoring the rest area, looking for vulnerable people alone in their cars. Perhaps Michael was targeted, approached, and coerced out of his car. But there were witnesses at the rest area. Someone would have seen something. There would be evidence of coercion or force. The fifth theory, and this is where things get strange, is that Michael's disappearance was the result of something paranormal or unexplainable. Some people have suggested alien abduction. Some have suggested time slips or interdimensional phenomena. Some have suggested that Michael's disappearance was part of a pattern of vanishings that occurs at specific locations and times that we don't yet understand. These theories sound far-fetched, but they're proposed seriously by people who've studied the case extensively. The truth is that none of these theories adequately explain Michael Chen's disappearance. The case sits in a strange space between the rational and the inexplicable. It's a case where the evidence doesn't support any clear conclusion. It's a case where a man simply vanished and nobody can explain how or why. It's a case that haunts investigators to this day because it violates everything we think we know about how the world works. Michael Chen's disappearance devastated his family. He had a wife named Susan and 2 teenage children. When Michael didn't return from his business trip, when investigators started looking into his case, when it became clear that he'd simply vanished, it destroyed them. Susan spent years trying to understand what happened. She contacted psychics. investigated conspiracy theories, joined support groups for families of missing persons. She desperately wanted answers that nobody could provide. Michael's children grew up with an absence that never made sense. Their father hadn't died. There was no body, no funeral, no closure. He'd simply disappeared. For years they held on to hope that their father would return. As they got older, that hope transformed into confusion and eventually into a kind of grief that was hard to process because it wasn't quite like normal grief. How do you mourn someone who might still be alive somewhere? How do you move forward when you don't know what happened? The sales industry took notice of Michael's case. It became a cautionary tale about the dangers of traveling alone. Companies started recommending that their traveling employees never pull over alone at night. Salesmen started taking photographs of each other before rest stops, creating makeshift documentation of their whereabouts. But Michael's case also sparked a broader conversation about how many people disappear from highways every year, how many cases go unsolved, how many families never get answers. Michael's case files were eventually made public. Investigators who'd worked on it spoke to journalists and researchers. Every few years, someone would propose a new theory about what happened. Every few years, someone would claim to have seen Michael in some distant location in California, in New Mexico, in Oregon. But none of these leads ever panned out. None of them ever brought Michael's family closer to answers. They all led nowhere. What's remarkable about Michael Chen's case is not just the mystery of his disappearance, but the way it illustrated gaps in how missing persons are investigated. When someone disappears from a locked car, when there's no evidence of forced entry, when there's no body and no clear crime, what do you investigate? How do you pursue leads that don't exist? How do you solve a case that seems to violate the laws of physics? More than 30 years have passed since Michael Chen disappeared. Susan Chen eventually remarried, though she never fully moved on from the loss of her husband. Michael's children grew up and had families of their own, but they never stopped wondering what happened to their father. At family gatherings, his absence is always felt. On his birthday, there's always a moment of silence. And every few years, someone in the family reaches out to see if there have been any new developments in the case. His disappearance serves as a reminder that there are still things that happen in America that we cannot explain. There are still people who vanish without a trace. There are still families left without answers. And there are still mysteries that haunt us, even as decades pass and the world changes around them. Michael Chen's story is the kind of case that sits with you. It's the kind of mystery that makes you think twice about certain situations. It's the kind of disappearance that challenges our assumptions about safety and rationality. We live in a world where we believe that if something happens, there must be an explanation. We believe in cause and effect. We believe that evidence reveals truth. But Michael Chen's case suggests that sometimes reality is more complicated than our frameworks for understanding it. When you're alone on a dark highway, when you're tired and you need to rest, when you pull into a rest area thinking you'll be safe, do you ever consider that you might disappear? Do you ever consider that there might be factors at work that are beyond your understanding or control? Most people don't. Most people assume that they're safe in the United States, that law enforcement can handle any situation, that the world operates according to rules we understand. Michael Chen's case is a reminder that this assumption might be naive. Not necessarily naive in the sense that supernatural forces are at work, or that there's some vast conspiracy, but naive in the sense that there are genuinely unexplainable things that happen. There are cases that defy investigation. There are mysteries that remain mysteries despite decades of effort. The question that haunts Michael Chen's case is simple. What happened? Where did he go? How did he leave that locked car? Why hasn't his family ever gotten answers? These are questions that keep investigators awake at night. These are questions that suggest that our world is stranger and more dangerous than we typically acknowledge. What's also notable about Michael Chen's case is how relatively unknown it is. Michael isn't a name that most people recognize. His disappearance isn't widely known outside of true crime circles. He's one of thousands of people who've disappeared without explanation. He's one of many cases that remains unsolved. And in some ways, that anonymity is part of what makes his story so disturbing. The idea that people can simply vanish and be forgotten, that their disappearances can fade into obscurity, that their family's pain can go unacknowledged by the wider world. Michael Chen pulled over to rest on a dark highway. He locked his car door. He settled in for a short sleep. And he never woke up in a way that we can understand or explain. His case remains open. His family remains without answers. And Michael remains missing, somewhere in the space between explanation and mystery, between the rational and the inexplicable. His story is just the first of three. But it's a story that sets the tone for what comes next. Stories of people who pulled over and disappeared, people who were lost to circumstances that defy understanding, people whose families are left with questions that may never be answered. Each story builds on the last. Each mystery adds weight to the question. What is really happening on America's highways at night? Michael Chen's case remains one of the most puzzling disappearances in American highway history. A man disappeared from a locked car in a well-lit rest area, leaving behind all his possessions, all his identification, all his means of survival. Decades later, there are still no answers. His family still doesn't know what happened to him. Investigators still can't explain how he disappeared, and Michael remains missing. This is just the first of three stories. We have two more cases ahead of us, equally mysterious, equally disturbing, equally impossible to explain. Sarah Mitchell and the Hartley family are waiting. Their stories are equally haunting, their mysteries are equally deep, and their disappearances are equally unexplainable. But before we move to the next story, take a moment to consider what you've just learned. Consider the questions that remain unanswered. Consider what it means that a person can simply vanish from a locked space. Consider what it might feel like to be Michael's family, never knowing what happened, never getting closure, never being able to move forward. These stories matter because they remind us that there are still mysteries in our world. There are still questions that can't be answered. There are still people who disappeared for reasons we may never understand. And there are still families looking for answers that may never come. Stay tuned for the second story. It's even more disturbing than Michael Chen's case. It will challenge everything you think you know about what's possible on American highways at night. And it involves a woman who disappeared under circumstances that make no rational sense whatsoever. Sarah Mitchell was a 34-year-old accountant who lived in San Francisco with her husband, David, and their two children. She was organized, disciplined, and careful. The kind of person who planned everything, who followed the rules, who didn't take unnecessary risks. She was well liked at her accounting firm. She was active in her community. She was, by all accounts, a responsible adult living a normal life. In September of 2001, Sarah was driving to visit her sister in Los Angeles. It was a drive she'd made several times before. Highway 101 is a well-traveled route down the California coast. Not remote, not particularly dangerous, just a regular highway that millions of people drive every year. Sarah left San Francisco around 8 p.m. She told her husband she'd arrive in LA around midnight. She said she'd call when she got there. Around 11 p.m., Sarah called her husband from her car. She said she was tired and that she was going to pull over at a rest area to use the bathroom and grab a coffee to keep herself alert. She said she'd be back on the road in 10 minutes. She told David she loved him and that she'd call him when she arrived in Los Angeles. David told her to be safe. He told her to drive carefully. He told her he'd see her soon. Sarah pulled into a rest area on Highway 101 near Monterey County, California. It was late at night, around 11:15 p.m. The rest area was relatively empty. There were a few other cars parked there, but not many. Sarah parked her white Honda Civic in a well-lit spot. She locked the doors. She got out of her car to use the restroom facilities. She called her husband again from the rest area. She said she was on her way back to the car. She said she'd be back on the road in just a few minutes. She told him she loved him. That was the last time David Mitchell ever heard his wife's voice. When Sarah didn't arrive in Los Angeles, when she didn't call to say she'd arrived, David started to get worried. He called her cell phone. It went to voicemail. He called again. Still voicemail. He waited an hour and called again. Nothing. Around 2 a.m., David called the California Highway Patrol and reported his wife missing. By the time Highway Patrol arrived at the rest area, they found Sarah's white Honda Civic exactly where she'd left it. The doors were locked. The windows were closed. Inside the car, they found Sarah's purse, her wallet, her phone, her keys, everything she'd had with her. But Sarah was gone. She'd disappeared from a locked car in a rest area on a major highway, leaving behind everything she owned. What happened next would challenge every assumption about how people disappear and why families of missing persons often never get answers. The investigation into Sarah Mitchell's disappearance began immediately. Highway Patrol officers examined her car thoroughly. They found no signs of forced entry. The doors had been locked from the inside. The windows were intact. There was no evidence of struggle or violence inside the vehicle. Sarah's belongings were all there. Her purse, her wallet, her identification, her keys, her phone. It was like she'd simply stepped out of her car and vanished. The initial theory was that Sarah had been abducted. Perhaps someone had approached her at the rest area and forced her into another vehicle. But there were other people at the rest area. Multiple witnesses reported seeing Sarah's car. Some remembered seeing a woman matching Sarah's description, but nobody reported seeing anything suspicious. Nobody reported seeing someone forcing a woman into a car. Nobody reported hearing any screams or any sounds of struggle. The second theory was that Sarah had voluntarily walked away. Perhaps she was having a mental health crisis. Perhaps she'd decided she couldn't go on and had walked into the night to disappear. But this didn't align with what anyone knew about Sarah. She had no history of mental illness. She had a stable job, a loving family, a good life. There was nothing to suggest she was suicidal or that she wanted to disappear. Police checked local hospitals and jails. They put out alerts. They contacted her family and friends. They searched the area around the rest stop. But Sarah Mitchell had simply vanished. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. And still, there was no sign of Sarah. No body was ever found. No ransom demand was ever made. No credible sightings were ever reported. The case attracted attention from the media. Sarah's disappearance was covered on local news and eventually on national news. Her face appeared on missing persons posters. Her family made appeals on television. They begged anyone who had information to come forward. But nothing came of it. The leads that came in went nowhere. The theories that were proposed didn't hold up to scrutiny. What made Sarah's case particularly disturbing was the absolute normalcy of the circumstances. She wasn't in a remote location. She wasn't alone in the middle of nowhere. She was at a rest area on a major California highway. There were other people there. There was lighting. There was a sense of relative safety. And yet, Sarah had disappeared as completely as if she'd stepped into another dimension. The investigation eventually grew cold. Years passed. Sarah remained missing. Her family remained without answers. And the case became one of hundreds of similar disappearances that happen on American highways every year. Cases that receive media attention for a brief moment and then fade into obscurity, leaving families devastated and investigators frustrated by the lack of closure. As investigators dug deeper into Sarah Mitchell's disappearance, several theories emerged about what might have happened to her. Each theory had its own problems, its own logical inconsistencies, its own reasons why it didn't quite fit the facts of the case. The first theory was that Sarah had been abducted by a serial predator. California had experienced multiple serial killers in the 1990s and 2000s. The idea was that someone had been targeting women at rest areas, and Sarah had been a victim. But if this were true, why were there no bodies? Why was there no pattern of similar disappearances that could be connected to Sarah's case? And how would someone have forced Sarah into another vehicle without witnesses noticing? The second theory was that Sarah had been the victim of human trafficking. The idea was that she'd been targeted at the rest area, drugged perhaps, and taken by human traffickers. But Sarah had called her husband to say she was on her way back to her car. She didn't sound distressed. She didn't sound like she was in danger. And if she'd been drugged and taken, where was her body? Where was the evidence? The third theory was that Sarah had experienced sudden onset amnesia or a dissociative episode. She'd stepped out of her car and completely lost her memory of who she was and where she was. She'd wandered away confused, unable to remember her name or her life. But extensive searches of the area found nothing. If Sarah had wandered into the California wilderness disoriented and confused, someone would have found her body by now. 30 years later, nothing has been found. The fourth theory was that Sarah had deliberately disappeared. She'd decided she wanted a new life and had orchestrated her own disappearance. But this theory falls apart under scrutiny. Sarah had no reason to leave her family. She had a good marriage, 2 children she loved, a stable job. She'd called her husband just before she disappeared to tell him she loved him. Why would someone planning to disappear make such a personal call to their spouse? The fifth theory was that Sarah had been taken by someone she knew. Perhaps someone she'd met at the rest area was someone she recognized. Perhaps it was someone from her past who'd orchestrated her abduction. But there was no evidence to support this theory. Sarah's friends and family were investigated. Nobody had any obvious motive or opportunity to take her. The most disturbing aspect of Sarah Mitchell's case is not just that she disappeared, but that she disappeared so completely and so utterly that it's as if she never existed. No body, no evidence, no closure. Just a locked car, a purse full of her belongings, and a family left without any answers about what happened to their wife, their mother, their daughter. Sarah Mitchell's disappearance shattered her family in ways that are hard to articulate. David Mitchell went from being a normal man with a normal life to being the husband of a missing person. He had to explain to his children where their mother went. He had to tell them that she disappeared and that he didn't know what happened to her. He had to live with the uncertainty, the not knowing, the constant wondering if his wife was alive somewhere or if she was dead. David became an advocate for missing persons. He spoke at conferences about highway safety. He pushed for better security at rest areas. He worked with law enforcement to keep Sarah's case in the public eye. But years turned into decades, and Sarah remained missing. David eventually had to accept that he might never know what happened to his wife. That acceptance came with its own kind of pain, the pain of surrendering hope, the pain of living with permanent uncertainty. Sarah's children grew up without their mother. They had their father, and their father did his best to be both parents to them. But there was always an absence. There was always a question mark. At holidays and birthdays, Sarah's absence was felt acutely. The children grew up wondering what happened to their mother. They grew up with an unsolved mystery at the heart of their family story. The case attracted attention from true crime investigators and amateur sleuths. Over the years, several people have claimed to have seen Sarah in different parts of the country. There have been false leads and theories proposed by people who thought they'd figured out what happened. But none of these leads have ever panned out. None of them have led to Sarah. The case remains as unsolved today as it was on the night she disappeared. What's particularly cruel about Sarah's case is the complete absence of resolution. With many missing persons cases, families eventually get some kind of answer. A body is found, a confession is made, a theory is confirmed. But with Sarah Mitchell there is nothing. No answer, no closure, no way to move forward with certainty about what happened. David Mitchell eventually remarried, though he never stopped looking for answers about his first wife. Sarah's children grew into adults with a missing mother, whose fate remains unknown. The case file remains open. Highway Patrol still investigates tips, though they acknowledge that after more than 2 decades, the chances of finding answers are slim. Sarah Mitchell pulled over to use a restroom at a rest area on a major California highway. She called her husband to tell him she loved him, and then she vanished, leaving behind a locked car, all her possessions, and a family fractured by the mystery of her disappearance. Her fate remains unknown. Her story remains unresolved, and her absence continues to haunt everyone who knew her. Sarah Mitchell's case is particularly unsettling because it combines the familiar with the inexplicable. She wasn't in a remote location. She wasn't doing anything unusual or risky. She was on a major California highway at a rest area where thousands of people stop every year. She was doing something that millions of people do without incident, stopping to use a restroom on a long drive. And yet, she disappeared, completely and utterly. In a way that defies explanation, what makes Sarah's case different from Michael Chen's case is the element of time. With Michael, the disappearance was sudden and immediate. He laid down to sleep and never woke up. With Sarah, there was a gap. She called her husband. She was aware. She was conscious. She was moving through the world with intention. And then she vanished. The question that haunts Sarah's case is not just what happened to her, but where she is. Is Sarah still alive somewhere, living a different life, unable to remember who she was? Is she dead somewhere, her body hidden where it has never been found? Did she simply walk away and disappear into the California landscape? Or did something happen that we simply cannot explain or understand? What's most disturbing about Sarah's case is the absolute finality of it. She's been gone for more than 2 decades. The chances of finding her alive are essentially zero. The chances of solving the case grow smaller every year. And yet, her family still holds on to hope. David still wonders. Her children still ask questions. And the mystery remains. Sarah Mitchell pulled over at a rest area on Highway 101. She used the bathroom. She called her husband to tell him she loved him. She told him she'd be back on the road in a few minutes. And then she stepped out of that rest area and into the space between explanation and mystery, between the rational and the inexplicable. She stepped into a gap in reality that has never been filled. Her disappearance raises profound questions about the safety of places we think are safe. It raises questions about what can happen to us when we're alone and vulnerable. It raises questions about the fragility of our existence and how quickly our lives can be altered or ended by forces we don't understand. Sarah's case is a reminder that the world is more mysterious and more dangerous than we typically acknowledge. It's a reminder that people can disappear, that families can be shattered by not knowing, that mysteries can persist for decades without resolution. And it's a reminder that when we're alone on a dark highway, we're more vulnerable than we realize. Sarah Mitchell remains missing. Her case remains unsolved. And her family remains without answers about what happened on that September night in 2001 when she pulled over at a rest area and disappeared. Sarah Mitchell's case remains one of the most haunting disappearances on American highways. An accountant driving to visit her sister. A woman who stopped at a rest area to use a bathroom. A wife who called her husband to tell him she loved him. And then she was gone. No body. No ransom, no resolution, just a locked car and a family left without answers. We now have 2 stories, 2 cases, 2 families devastated by disappearances that make no sense. Michael Chen disappeared from a locked car in Arizona. Sarah Mitchell disappeared from a rest area in California. 2 different people, 2 different circumstances, 2 different highways. but the same fundamental mystery. How does someone simply vanish? The third story is waiting. The Hartley family. A 7-year-old girl named Rachel. Parents who looked away for just a moment. A disappearance that happened in front of witnesses. A case that raises questions about what happens when children vanish and families are left searching. But before we move to that story, consider what you've learned. Consider the fear you're feeling. Consider how these cases challenge everything you think you know about safety on American highways. Consider how quickly normalcy can transform into mystery. These stories matter because they remind us that there are still unknowns in our world. There are still things that happen that we cannot explain, and there are still families living with the weight of permanent uncertainty. Sarah Mitchell remains missing. Michael Chen remains missing. And a third story, equally disturbing, equally tragic, is waiting to be told. The mystery of what happens when people pull over on American highways at night continues. The Hartley family was an ordinary American family. Tom and Linda Hartley were middle-class parents living in Colorado. They had 3 children, 2 teenagers, and a 7-year-old daughter named Rachel. Rachel was a normal, happy kid. She went to school, she had friends, she played soccer. She was the kind of child that any parent would be proud of. By all accounts, the Hartley family was happy and stable and normal. In August of 1989, the Hartley family decided to take a road trip. They wanted to drive to visit family in New Mexico. It was a long drive, about 6 hours from their home in Colorado. They planned to make it an adventure for the kids. They'd stop at rest areas and let the children run around. They'd stop for meals at diners. It was going to be a fun family experience. Around 4 p.m., as they were driving down a dark stretch of Highway 285 in Colorado, 7-year-old Rachel said she needed to use the bathroom. Tom pulled into a rest area. It was one of those typical Colorado rest areas. A few picnic tables, bathrooms, some parking spaces. There weren't many people there. It was relatively quiet and empty. Tom told Rachel to go use the bathroom. Linda went with her. Tom waited by the car with the other 2 children. He said later that he only looked away for a moment. He was watching his other kids. He was paying attention. But for just a few seconds, his attention was divided. For just a moment, he wasn't watching Rachel directly. When Linda came back out of the bathroom, Rachel wasn't with her. Linda asked where Rachel was. Tom said he thought she was still in the bathroom with Linda. Linda went back to check. The bathrooms were empty. Rachel was gone. What happened in the next moments was the beginning of every parent's worst nightmare. A child had vanished. Not in a remote location, not in the middle of nowhere, but at a rest area on a major highway during what should have been an ordinary family trip. Rachel Hartley, age 7, had simply disappeared. The investigation began immediately. Police arrived within minutes. They searched the rest area and the surrounding area. They questioned other people who'd been at the rest area. But there was no sign of Rachel. No body. No evidence of abduction. Just a child who'd gone to use a bathroom and never came back. What made Rachel's disappearance different from the other cases we've discussed is that it happened in front of witnesses. Her parents were there. Other people were at the rest area. This wasn't a case of someone disappearing alone on a dark highway. This was a case of a child vanishing in plain sight, in the presence of her parents, at a location where there were other people around. And yet Rachel Hartley disappeared as completely as if she'd stepped into thin air. The search for Rachel Hartley became one of the most intensive child disappearance investigations Colorado had ever seen. Police brought in dogs. They searched the woods surrounding the rest area. They dredged nearby ponds and streams. They searched buildings in the surrounding area. They interviewed everyone who'd been at the rest area. But Rachel remained missing. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. Search and rescue teams covered hundreds of square miles, looking for any sign of Rachel. Volunteers came from across Colorado to help search. Posters with Rachel's face were put up in every town within 100 miles. Her parents made tearful appeals on television. But Rachel was never found. The initial theory was that someone had abducted Rachel. Perhaps someone at the rest area had taken her. Perhaps someone had been watching the family and had seen an opportunity. But who would do such a thing? And why? And where would they take a child in broad daylight without being seen? Police investigated every person who'd been at the rest area that day. They looked for anyone with a history of child abduction. They considered whether someone from the surrounding area might have been involved. But there were no suspects. There was no evidence of foul play. There was just a missing child and a mystery that made no sense. The second theory was that Rachel had simply wandered away from the rest area. Perhaps she'd gotten confused or disoriented. Perhaps she'd walked into the woods and gotten lost. But extensive searches of the area found nothing. If Rachel had wandered into the Colorado wilderness, surely her body would have been found by now. Surely someone would have discovered some evidence of her. But nothing was ever found. The third theory was that Rachel had been taken by someone she knew. Perhaps a family member or acquaintance had orchestrated her abduction. But there was no evidence to support this theory. No family member or acquaintance had any reason to take Rachel. No one had the means or opportunity to take her. The fourth theory was more disturbing. Some people suggested that Rachel had been taken by someone who'd been specifically targeting rest areas, someone who'd been watching families, someone who'd been waiting for an opportunity to take a child. This theory suggested that Rachel's abduction was part of a pattern of child predation that law enforcement hadn't connected. The fifth theory, and the one that made the least sense, but that some people believed anyway, was that Rachel had been taken by something or someone that defied conventional explanation. Some people whispered about supernatural abductions. Some people talked about interdimensional phenomena. Some people suggested that Rachel's disappearance was part of a larger pattern of vanishings that occurred at specific locations. The truth is that nobody knows what happened to Rachel Hartley. She disappeared from a rest area in Colorado in 1989 and was never found. She was 7 years old. She had her whole life ahead of her. And then she was gone. The disappearance of Rachel Hartley devastated her family in ways that are profound and ongoing. Tom and Linda Hartley never recovered from losing their daughter. They spent years searching. They followed every lead. They investigated every theory. But their daughter never came home. Tom and Linda's other children grew up in the shadow of their sister's disappearance. They grew up with a missing sibling whose fate remained unknown. They grew up wondering what happened to their little sister. They grew up with an empty chair at the dinner table, an empty room in the house, an empty space in their family that could never be filled. The case attracted national attention. Rachel's face appeared on missing children posters across the country. Her disappearance was featured on television shows about unsolved mysteries. But years turned into decades, and Rachel remained missing. The investigation eventually grew cold. Police eventually had to move on to other cases, but the mystery of what happened to Rachel Hartley remained. In 1989, there was no Amber Alert system. There was no National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. There was no internet where information about missing children could be instantly shared across the country. The resources available to search for missing children were far more limited than they are today. So Rachel's disappearance occurred in a different era, with different tools available to investigators, with different limitations on how quickly information could be shared. This doesn't excuse what happened to Rachel or make her disappearance any less tragic. But it does suggest that if Rachel had disappeared today, with modern technology and modern investigative techniques, perhaps the outcome would be different. Perhaps she would have been found. Perhaps her family would have gotten answers. But Rachel disappeared in 1989, in an era when a child could vanish from a rest area and effectively disappear from the world. And that's what happened. Rachel Hartley pulled over at a rest area to use a bathroom. Her parents looked away for a moment, and she was gone. Rachel Hartley's case raises profound questions about child safety and parental responsibility. It raises questions about how quickly children can disappear and how little it takes for a normal family moment to transform into tragedy. It raises questions about the dangers lurking at places we think are safe, at rest areas where thousands of families stop every year. What makes Rachel's case particularly disturbing is that her parents were there. This wasn't a case of a child being left alone. This wasn't a case of negligent parenting. This was a case of a child disappearing despite the presence of her parents and despite being in a location with other people around. The question that haunts Rachel's case is not just what happened to her, but how she disappeared. How does a 7-year-old child vanish from a rest area where her mother just left her? How does she disappear when there are other people around? How does she vanish without a trace? Rachel Hartley remains missing. Her case remains unsolved. She would be in her 50s now if she were alive. But her family still doesn't know what happened to her. Her family still doesn't have closure. And the mystery of her disappearance, a child who vanished in plain sight at a rest area on a Colorado highway, continues to haunt investigators and families across the country. The disappearance of Rachel Hartley is different from the cases of Michael Chen and Sarah Mitchell in that it involves a child. It involves parents who will never know what happened to their daughter. It involves siblings who will never know what happened to their sister. It involves a family fractured by a mystery that defies explanation. Rachel's disappearance also raises questions about patterns. Michael Chen disappeared from a locked car in Arizona in 1993. Sarah Mitchell disappeared from a rest area in California in 2001. Rachel Hartley disappeared from a rest area in Colorado in 1989. 3 different people, 3 different times, 3 different locations. But all 3 disappeared from rest areas or near rest areas on American highways. All 3 disappeared in ways that defy rational explanation. All 3 left families without answers. Is there a pattern here? Are these cases connected? Or are they just unfortunate coincidences, examples of the dangers that lurk on American highways, places where people are vulnerable and where bad things can happen? Rachel's case is a reminder that children are particularly vulnerable to predators. It's a reminder that evil doesn't always announce itself. It's a reminder that sometimes the worst things happen in the most ordinary circumstances, in places we think are safe, when we're just trying to live our normal lives. Rachel Hartley disappeared over 30 years ago. Her case remains open. Her family remains without answers. And her disappearance remains a mystery that continues to challenge our assumptions about safety on American highways. Rachel Hartley pulled over at a rest area to use a bathroom. She walked to the bathroom with her mother, and then she vanished. Her parents didn't see who took her. They didn't see anything suspicious. She simply disappeared. One moment she was there, the next moment she was gone. And 30 years later, nobody knows where she is or what happened to her. We have now told 3 stories, 3 cases, 3 families, 3 mysteries that remain unsolved. Michael Chen disappeared from a locked car in Arizona. Sarah Mitchell disappeared from a rest area in California. Rachel Hartley disappeared from a rest area in Colorado. 3 different people, 3 different circumstances. 3 different disappearances that defy explanation. But they all have something in common. They all involve people pulling over on American highways. They all involve moments of vulnerability. They all involve disappearances that have never been explained. They all involve families left without answers, without closure, without any way to move forward with certainty about what happened. These are just 3 stories. But they represent a pattern. They represent the reality that people disappear on American highways every year. They represent the reality that these disappearances often remain unsolved. They represent the reality that families are left devastated by mysteries that may never be resolved. When you pull over on a dark highway, when you stop at a rest area late at night, when you let your guard down thinking you're in a safe place. Remember these stories. Remember Michael Chen. Remember Sarah Mitchell. Remember Rachel Hartley. Remember that there are still unexplained disappearances happening on American highways. Remember that mysteries persist despite decades of investigation. Remember that the world is stranger and more dangerous than we typically acknowledge. Rachel Hartley remains missing. Michael Chen remains missing. Sarah Mitchell remains missing. And somewhere on American highways, the mystery continues. 3 true stories of people who vanished after pulling over at night. 3 cases, 3 families, 3 mysteries that remain unsolved. This is what happens when people pull over on dark highways. This is what happens when they become vulnerable. This is what happens in the space between the familiar and the inexplicable, in the gaps where people disappear and are never seen again.